Thanks very much for coming. I know it's not always easy to get people to come out before Christmas to sessions, so thank you. We're not 2 minutes, so it'll be intimate, so feel free to ask questions, interrupt, and we'll make it as interactive as we can. So this is the topic for today, and I'm going to talk a little bit, for those of you who don't know me, about my background, because it comes into the work, because it's fairly heavily based in phenomenology. But I thought we would flip it upside down and start with context, rather than start with the work itself, so that we can situate why I came to look at this question and why I came to write. So this is a chapter in a book that was published in 2019, and why this came together. So internationalization is something that has become relevant to all campuses in North America. We've seen an explosion of in the numbers of international students on most campuses in North America, US and actually in the UK too, and in the global north, we could say. And obviously this has led to some great benefits. So obviously, financial. It's become the bread and butter of many universities. So I'm going to talk a lot about the last 3 years before I came to Royal Roads. I was at University of Prince Edward Island, and I'm going to be referring to that as a sort of case study. 27%, I think, now of international students on UPI. So even a very rural, very small province, still a huge amount of students. And that's actually something that for many universities has become a lifeline. So UPI is the only university in the Maritimes that has an intake of students going up as opposed to declining, and it's mainly because of international students. So obviously the focus is there, it's very present. So that's one of the benefits, obviously, the just financial sustainability. But obviously it's also brought a lot of other gains. A global lens added to delivery of our programs, forcing us to look at the international dimensions of whatever we're discussing, whatever we're teaching, whatever we're offering. So that's been great. A decolonization of the curriculum. So I find in Canada we talk a lot about decolonization of the curriculum because of the TRC, indigenous concerns, but we have to decolonize the curriculum when it comes to international students as well. So an experience I've had, for example, teaching a course in theory with students in a very first class saying, but isn't all that theory very Western? And what are you going to do about it? Right? So I think this has pushed us to think beyond the parameters of what we normally function within, and that's been great for the higher education context. Social gains in terms on an international scale. So we talk about social capital within our classrooms. Here we talk about the cohort model, but it's allowed us to do this on an international scale, which is great. So we don't just have the social capital forming on local and regional level, but we now have people creating these networks on international scales. And a globalization of networks and experiential opportunities too. So a lot of higher ed is geared now to focused on experiential learning, right? Taking that learning and connecting it to the outside world. But now it doesn't just connect with a regional context. We're allowing our students to connect, obviously, on an international scale. And think here that for every international students that comes to our programs, there's obviously some of our domestic programs leaving on exchanges and leaving on Euroboards as well. So that's that sort of mixed two-way stream. So that's been great. Lots of benefits, lots of positives. But it's also given rise to specific concerns regarding teaching and learning. So what I'd like you to do is perhaps take a few minutes together, and if people are on live stream, they could do it together online, and think of some of the observations or some of the experiences that you've had if you're an instructor, where you felt tension, where you felt that there has been challenges about integrating and including international students within our higher ed classrooms. So I'd like to give you a few minutes. You will not share this with the rest of the room. It's really just for your table, but we will come back to it later when we look at UDL and maybe get you to work on what you've actually jotted down on your piece of paper. So don't be afraid. You don't need to share. You don't need for visibility in the room, but do write things down, because I think it will help when we get to concretely look at how we can use UDL to try and get past those hurdles. So let's say we'll give you about 4 or 5 minutes. See if the conversation goes. We can give you a little bit more. Okay, I'm going to bring you back to the large group. It's a pity to be cutting into some really interesting conversations, but we only have 1 hour, and we're going to come back to your drawings or your notes, and then you'll be talking about them again. Okay? So don't worry, we'll come back to those conversations, but I just want to to move on a little bit with the presentation itself. So I wanted to do a personal introduction for those of you who don't know me, but also because, again, this chapter was written from a phenological sort of perspective, using my experience for 3 years as an academic lead on a program that had a very high proportion of international students on the master's level. So I'm going to highlight this, but I'm actually going to do it upside down, which would have made more sense because now I work here, I'm program head here, but before that I was assistant professor at University of Prince Edward Island, and before that even I was director of the Office for Students with Disabilities at McGill for 4 years. Before that I'd been a teacher, principal. I didn't want to stop working, so I thought, while I do the PhD, I'll carry on working, get another job, and that's why I chose something a little bit out of my field and went to work in disability for 4 years. Did a lot of work around universal design for learning, a lot of work around social model. Then I finished PhD, got my first job at University of Prince Edward Island. Arrived, was offered this position of being academic lead, which is pretty much the same as program head, and felt, well, this is great, first job, academic lead. And then I realized that the Faculty of Education at UPI had 4 masters, 3 online, mostly domestic, and 1 face-to-face and entirely international, which means that the classes were all 100% international students. And as I went into that program as academic lead, with pretty much the same responsibility as a program head here, so having to recruit contract faculty and then deal with tension between sometimes students and contract faculty, hitting hurdles very quickly. And I think it's not just typical of that program and that experience I've had. I think it echoes what I hear a lot of other people discussing in a lot of other campuses. So we're very quick to say, this is great, we're opening up internationalization, globalization, we want this high proportion of international students, but it does create tension in terms of pedagogy within the classroom, and often there's a tension there that hasn't been solved, and sometimes faculty don't have support for that. So my role very quickly for 3 years became, well, what do you do and how do I solve this? So some of the frequent issues were either contract faculty starting and then actually quitting, so leaving halfway through a program, or core faculty saying, I don't teach on international programs at all, so you're going to find another solution. And then having to give people tools, having to come up with something that was a framework, some sort of guidance to help them actually find their way through this and actually realize it's not as tough as it seems. And there are some very practical pedagogical solutions here to this tension that we're experiencing. For me, and this is the sort of phenomenological perspective of this chapter, it made total sense, having come from 4 years of disability and working in universal design for learning, to say, well, this works really well with students with disabilities. Why don't we try this with international students and see if this solves some of the tension? So this is pretty much what I'm going to be talking about to you today, this practical application of UDL to a context that UDL wasn't conceived for, but that actually is very efficient in actually resolving some of the tension, maybe some of the tension that you've written on the table itself. So in terms of narrative, this works really well. Certainly made my life a lot easier. Greater satisfaction from the students. Students were really struggling in the first semester, ending up becoming thesis students, to the amazement of everyone. So being able to resolve a lot of this tension and actually making it enjoyable for the students, and also making it fairly enjoyable for the instructors themselves. And that's where UDL came in and was really useful. So what is UDL? I don't want to spend the entire hour talking about UDL and defining it, but I thought it would be still interesting to explain it in basics. So when I worked at McGill for 4 years and we use UDL a lot, there's a lot of definitions, a lot of sometimes discussion around what's the perfect definition. And we came up with this sort of fairly long definition, but that we put a lot of thought into. So I'm going to read it to you, and I will come back to it again after I've unpacked it. Universal Design for Learning is a sustainable, this is going to be very important, environment-focused framework to manage learner diversity in the classroom, which shifts the focus away from the deficit model by bringing to the forefront the notion of user-friendly design in instruction and assessment. And it translates the social model of disability into classroom practice. So there's a lot packed in there, but we're going to unpack it a little bit. So why sustainable? The old-fashioned way of dealing with students with disabilities in universities is to provide accommodation, what we call retrofitting. This is actually extremely costly, right? When I was at McGill, the budget of the Office for Students with Disabilities was over $1.2 million. This is money that every year you're just spending out the window because it's not changing the system, it's not changing the pedagogy, it's just retrofitting that you're spending systematically every semester. So any way that we have of changing that, and I think you'll see that universities around the world are saying this is too costly, we can't carry on doing retrofitting, we have to find more sustainable ways of doing pedagogy that is inclusive, is going to be valid, and UDL really addresses that. Environment focused, because UDL doesn't focus on individual differences. You no longer ask people to come up with, diagnostic instruments or an IEP or things like this. You're actually saying, we know it's there, we know there's learner diversity, we're not going to focus on individual diversity, we're actually going to focus on what we can do to be more inclusive. So it shifts away from that individual focus that otherwise is very much there, onto the instructor, the department, or the faculty of the school, actually changing the way it does things to actually be inclusive in general terms, without having anyone to have to say, oh, I have an issue with access, I need something done. And shifts away from the deficit model, where I've just explained that, because if you're no longer focusing on individual differences, then you're less likely to be stuck in the deficit model. You're not asking people for diagnostic instruments. You're actually saying, we know we have to be diverse, we know we have to be inclusive, we have to design differently, and we're doing it from the get-go. And it translates to social model of disability. Are you familiar with the social model of disability? More or less, yes, a little bit. So I'm going to explain very quickly, but basically, social model of disability, which has been around for about 30 years, sort of says when we talk about disability, it's not actually an inherent quality of people. We shouldn't be looking at saying this person has a disability or that person has a disability. It's not something which is inherently in people. It's really situated in interaction between people's embodiment and the expectations of the environment. So I'll give you two examples. One that always works, the person who's a wheelchair user. If you are a wheelchair user, you are not going to feel disabled if you can get on the bus, if you can go and do your hobbies, if you can go to the beach, if you can get to work, and everything's accessible. Now, if you live in a city such as Montreal, where even the public transport is not accessible, you're going to hit the perceptions of barriers the whole way, right? Even trying to get to work, trying to go to leisure, trying to do things. So we see how the disability is in that interaction. Yes, of course, there's the embodiment of someone who needs a wheelchair, but things can be structured and designed very differently in the environment, and it's in that interaction that disability is situated, not in the person themselves. Another example for us in universities, which is to do with learning and a classroom, ADHD. ADHD has been mediatized, it's now a disability. People will have IEPs, will have diagnostic instruments to show that they have ADHD. Now, if you work in accessibility services and you are in contact with students who have ADHD, you're not seeing them coming into a university environment and fail and have difficulties right through their 3 years or their 4 years. What you see is they will come in at times, they will need support, and then you don't see them again for a year and a half. And then they come in back for a semester, and then you don't see them again for a year. And sometimes they outperform their peers, right? So there's actually no issue of disability there. So why is that? Why is that these students are sometimes completely autonomous, need no support, and sometimes they are going back to accessibility services and they need a lot of support? What might be the difference between these experiences that they're having? What's happening in the classroom. So what sort of assessment are they subject to? Are they in a lecture only, stage on the stage, lecturing? If you put students with ADHD in these situations, they will have a feeling of disability. That's why you see them, performing badly and starting having, facing barriers and have hurdles. If you are in a very sort of active learning environment, those students function very well and they don't need support from accessibility and they go through their path fairly easily. So there you have, social model transferred to a classroom environment, and you can see that really it's not having ADHD, the disability, it's being in an environment where things are not designed in a way that allows you to function in an autonomous way and to be sort of productive. So how does it do that? UDL then becomes a framework, so it has sort of categories, and there's 3 categories. So David Rose and a whole bunch of neurospecialists have used a lot of literature to sort of say, well, actually in learning there are 3 basic dimensions. And really, to try and be as accessible, as flexible as possible, we need to be as diverse and offer as much flexibility within these 3 dimensions. So I've done that, social model, I've come back to that. These are the 3 dimensions, basically. Multiple means of representations, multiple means of action and expression, multiple means of engagement. So this is a bit of a jargon that UDL has created, but what do they mean by that? Those are the 3 dimensions, basically, of learning. Action representation is the way you provide information to learners. So think about all the ways in a classroom that you give information to learners when you're speaking, when you're projecting things, when you are talking, when you're giving resources. That's the action of representation. So having as much flexibility in that dimension, in that act. Action and expression is the opposite. When you're asking students to interact, to give feedback, to answer questions, to be assessed, to be talking to you, to be contributing, to be participating. So also giving as much flexibility to the students in the way they do that, in the way they're actually able to demonstrate those skills. And the last one, multiple means of engagement. That's what UDL scholars call the effective part of learning. So why are you even engaged? Why are you even interested in learning, right? Before you even get to the task of the practical task of doing something or listening to something. So those are the three, and basically that's what UDL does. And then you can dribble down to basically specific activities, specific sort of ways of redesigning. But really it's a lens that offers any practitioner the opportunity to actually think, am I being as accessible as I can? Am I actually offering as much flexibility to learners as I can? So it might still be a little bit abstract, but we're going to come down to see how does this work in practice. I'll just quickly go through this if you're interested. The origins of UDL obviously come from universal design, which is architectural. And this may actually help you understand how it works. So it comes from the School of Chicago, architectural school, who in the 70s started saying, being really irritated by saying we are building all these beautiful, aesthetically pleasant buildings, but then once you walk in them, the light switch are in the wrong place, the doors are not wide enough, the lighting is bad, the heating doesn't work, it's not conceived for you to live and work in. And so this sort of flip architecture to be more focused on user experience. As I say, before we design things to be nice, we have to design for them to be useful to the people who actually have to use them. So you take that and you transfer it to the classroom, and that's pretty much what David Rose and Cast have done with UDL. So to also think about the user experience and what do our learners need before we even start designing beautiful courses and beautiful learning experience. Okay, so why, when I started looking at this and when I started this notion of trying to use UDL with international students, it's a bit daunting at first because there isn't much literature on this. And so far, historically, really UDL has been used a lot with students with disabilities. There has been pockets of emerging work using UDL with indigenous students, but not so much yet with international students. Obviously, there's a lot of literature on multiculturalism, and that's interesting, but sometimes the multiculturalism as a lens doesn't take us far enough in terms of really revolutionizing the design of our pedagogy. Yes, it gives us the right mind shift, the right state of mind, the right approach to be empathetic with the students, but is that enough? Do we not need to actually take a deep look into our teaching practices to actually go a little bit further and see how we can be still ethnocentric in the way we design things? So that's what we're going to look at today and try and see if we can go back to those notes on your tables and see if you can see it having a difference. So I found it really easy when I started coordinating these instructors and using universal design for learning. I think whenever you're working with faculty, they want a model. They want a framework, right? They want to engage with that reflection, but they do need something that structures that reflection. So what I found is that UDL was really just convenient. It wasn't necessarily something new, but it was something convenient, which put them in a frame of mind to be willing to go back and redesign and to query whether some of the practices were ethnocentric and to look for other solutions. So again, as I've put in bold, that the shift operates from deficit model to proactive design mindset. So this is still important because do we use the deficit model with international students? I would argue that we do. And sometimes we do it with the best of intentions, but we very quickly, if you look around the world internationally, we're very quick in higher ed to go back to a deficit model sort of dialogue. Put two things there, the Duke professor, saying to Chinese students, you must speak English. When I was in Australia, actually talking about this chapter earlier in the fall, Murdoch sued, I don't know if you follow this, sued a professor who called himself a whistleblower saying international students have no place in our universities, right? So it gets really complex. There's other issues. Maybe Murdoch wasn't the most sort of subtle in the way they sort of reacted to that, but that tension is there, and we very much still deal with international students from that deficit model. So this is where UDL and even the social model become useful in shifting away from that deficit model, and actually realizing that often the international students have had advanced degrees before they got here, they have professional experience, they have competencies, but sometimes they have difficulties demonstrating them because the way we are actually designing our assignment, our instruction is very, very specific, and it often takes them a very long time before they can actually navigate this and understand the cultural sort of ethnocentrism of what we ask them to do. So I think at this stage I'm going to, in the interest of time, take you back to your activity and give you about 10 minutes to think of some of the things that you wrote there and try and see if you could use UDL to think of a different way to approach some of the hurdles or the challenges that you've put on your form, on your paper, and then to come up with a different way of doing things and suggestions as to how our practices in higher education could change using something like UDL to offer more flexibility and to be less ethnocentric in the expectations that we have with international students. After that, I'll run you through some examples which I used in the chapter as well, and some of the reflection I went through. But I think it'd be interesting if you engage with it first, and then we'll go into some of the examples I used in the chapter, and then you'll probably have questions. You okay with that? Okay. So yes. Yep. Yeah. Definitely. So the three lenses are there to really, you don't have to tackle all of them at the same time, right? For any barrier or hurdle that you see, there will probably be one of the dimensions that's more directly relevant because we're talking about representation or the students actually, doing action expression, or about engaging the students. And then see if you can inject in a design, from the design perspective, a little bit more flexibility in the way we do things to ease some of that tension. Okay? So we'll try that for about 5 minutes and come back to it and tackle any questions you might have. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask you to come back to a large group, if that's okay. Just so we can wrap up, but I'll keep it very interactive. So if you have questions or you want to contribute things from your table, feel free. We've got a microphone and we can integrate your reflection or your questions. Normally it gives rise to a lot of practical examples that people want to discuss. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 3 examples from the chapter of a reflection going through this that I've lived through and we, work through a redesign. And then we'll see if we want to open up and you have other questions or other examples you want to give. So obviously, in interest of time, in the chapter, I've given lots of examples within each of the categories, and they're sort of divided in the three axes of reflection. But I thought for today, I'd give you one example and try and go into a little bit more depth as to I'd lived through that redesign. So multiple means of representation. And for me, a big example has been the use of the LMS. So when I was there, we used Moodle too. And how we use Moodle as a depository especially for, obviously here we do a lot of online work, so we use it very differently, but don't forget in a lot of universities, we teach face-to-face. This was the case with this cohort. And then really the LMS was there as a depository for the notes, for the readings, and for things like this. So it can be very dry, and I think a lot of domestic students are fine with that, right? Well, you lecture, you do your class, and then you stick the notes and all the required resources onto Moodle. But I think it takes a complete different dimensions for international students. And what we found is that they became really, really dependent on the LMS and really did better or worse depending on what was available to them on the LMS and what instructors were actually providing. Now, we're used to providing a reading, but remember that when you have a student who arrives from China on their first semester and you give them a 5,000-word journal article, and then you go into class a week later and you say, and as I've heard people say, but they don't seem to have read it or understood it. It's very quick, again, deficit model. They didn't do the work, they can't understand it. But what I was seeing behind the stage is that these students were actually taking the dictionary and were reading this line per line. Now, how many of you domestic students are reading a journal article line per line? In abstract, go down to the findings. If they need to, they go back to the methodology. And that's the implicit messaging. So I'm going to talk about that a lot, the implicit messaging. Things that we take for granted, but we never actually take the time to actually explain to students that, in fact, that's when we say read this, we don't mean read this linearly from line 1 to the conclusion. And that often is a huge issue, right? So when we put readings, because international students obviously are battling the language of, trying to read things linearly, to use the LMS as a scaffolding tool, right? And it's easy enough when you are doing, and we do it for students with disabilities all the time. You're doing your formal reading, 5,000 word journal article, but often there's something on the website that's a lot shorter, a lot easier, less complexity, same content, but less density to get into. So you add that. Often now there's ready-made videos that will tackle the same topic, same concept, that give them another pathways. And that's what we talk about in UDL. It's offering people different pathways into your content. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not giving up on the idea that at one point they will feel comfortable enough reading that 5,000 word journal article. But in the meantime, you're giving them ways to get involved in the content, to master it, to get back to class and actually be able to be taking part in discussions, and then progressively to be tackling that big block, which is reading a 5,000 journal article in a second language. So something as simple as that, as using the LMS and systematically encouraging instructors to do that scaffolding, not just put one resource, but put several resources. When you think about the complexity of language, complexity of terminology, the time that they will require, right? Because you can't imagine if you're a student in a course, in international students, and you're taking 10 hours to read a journal article, and you've been given, 6 articles for next week. What that represents in your week and what it's going to look like. So sometimes UDL is as simple as that, a simple redesign, and that's in that dimension of representation in the way we offer information to students. But that in itself can be really, and I've seen it in practice, instructors then coming back and saying, this is wonderful, because now they're able to actually participate in discussions, they've engaged with the material, they know what we're talking about, they're actively contributing in this class, and then they slowly catch up on reading that journal article that's really tough for them, but they have a little more time to engage with that, but they're still active participants in the classroom. So in terms of action expressions, often when you adopt that axis of design thinking in UDL, you're often going to be brought back to assessment, because obviously often when we ask contribution from students, we also are assessing them, whether it's writing or participation in class. So it's one that we come back to often in terms of assessment. And I thought I would tackle this. So the course I was teaching was a master's in education. And I think it's very typical of what we see in graduate education around the country, is that we have this default where we are back to, it's either class presentation, group presentations, or 5,000 word papers, right? And it's like the two things that we juggle, and we're not that creative, and we fall back to that. Now, that paper, and it's hard sometimes with instructors to move them away from that, because they'll say, well, they need to learn how to write an academic paper. And that's true. And I think when you do a reflection on UDL, you go back to what are my core objectives, what are my core, the core assessment I'm doing. There's nothing wrong with saying I am assessing academic writing. One of my assessment is a paper, and the students will have to work through the semester towards that. But you will find often that now instructors will have 3 or 4 assessments that actually have nothing to do with academic writing, but we still default back to, oh, it's still going to have to be a piece of writing. And I've heard the conversation already on some of the tables. It's something that many faculties do sort of inherently, just by having the flexibility to say, if I'm not actually assessing academic writing, why don't I give the flexibility to students to actually present in the format that suits them? So to do a podcast, to do a video, to do graphics, to do other things to demonstrate their skills in another way. And I found once you get instructors to go through that process and to feel comfortable with this and saying, actually, yes, I'm only going to use papers when I'm actually assessing academic writing. When I'm assessing other skills, I'm asking them to do other things. Why am I systematically defaulting back to saying, I want this done in academic writing format? So just that, again, frees international students, I think, to demonstrate what they're able and what they're capable of in a really powerful way. And again, you get instructors coming right back to you and saying, this is amazing, because I thought they weren't connecting with the material. Now they're demonstrating that they understand it. It's rich learning. They're really able to do that. And they're demonstrating in a way that allows them to demonstrate their strength. Now, in disability, again, with UDL, we're very comfortable with that, right? Strengths-based learning. So we give people the choice with students with disabilities to choose the ways that they're strong at, and they can demonstrate their skills from their strength perspective. Why not do the same with international students? And it works very, very well. Okay. And often I think there's really, again, the deficit model, and I heard several conversations around the room around the deficit model. Even when we deny it, we fall back to that model of saying, oh, it's a language thing, but really maybe they're not quite ready. And really shaking people out of that and asking them to redesign in this way often allows them to then get that satisfaction of saying, actually, no, the students are highly engaged and they do deserve to be here and they are really getting to the gist of what we're doing, just because I'm giving them a little bit more freedom in demonstrating how they engage with this. And obviously, there's lots of different ways. Obviously, the problem is the rubric, and often with instructors, you get down to that notion of rubric. But what my rubric is written for academic writing. What do I do if it's a video? And I think that's where being program head or being academic lead in other universities, it is part of the job, to make people comfortable saying, you will see, it's not that much of a cliff. Try it. If your rubrics are just tweaked a little bit and they're designed in a way that actually allows for transfers, it then becomes very easy to actually do the marking exactly in the same way, with a format that's not the format that you are looking for. The amazing thing with this, obviously, and I think a lot of people who've tried it in other contexts will have the same feedback, is once you give students that flexibility, you often get work that exceeds your expectations. I had a student at one point say, can I do an animation? I'd never thought about it. So, I used to say podcast, video, text, graphics. I thought animation. And they, come back with 20 minutes professional level animations that totally get to the points that you're trying to assess and that you're trying to see demonstrated. So, having that openness to be willing to be surprised, to say, yes, I'm giving you the flexibility. You choose where your strengths are and you choose how you want to demonstrate what I'm trying to get you to demonstrate. I'm taking you now to the last dimension. I find this one tricky because in teaching generally, in pedagogy, we like to say we understand engagement. So it's one that's both easy for people to get comfortable with. Usually instructors and teachers always say, oh, this one I completely get. I understand how I need to show flexibility in that. But we don't often go very deep in that reflection. What is engagement? What actually creates that effective sort of part of learning? So I'll give you an example that's a little bit out of the box, but so I was teaching on a Master's of Education. And often, a lot of the assessment was asking them to reflect on practice. So here are these international students. They've flown over to Canada. They've been teachers elsewhere, but they've never been teachers in North American context. And we asked them to suddenly reflect on the connection between what we're teaching them and field practice, right? Which is something fairly ironic if you think they've never had the field practice part. And that's where the engagement was. How can you get them to do a rich, relevant, pertinent piece on connection with the field if you don't understand what the field was? And so there we were stuck thinking, well, we don't have time in this 18-month master's to send them in the field, right? That's not an option that we have. So what else can we do? What else can we add to this? And I had a support from international students, sort of support staff from the faculty itself. And we came up with this notion of starting a film club. And we started a film club, and every week we showed them a film, a pop culture that dealt with education, with some aspect of education, to create this context, right? So that then anything else that they were actually thinking about, actually they were gaining that context of what does North American teaching and teaching concern look like for them to then have relevant reflections on this. And this was a complete and utter success. I mean, beyond all of our expectations, because not only was attendance high, participations in this was high, interactions and questions about, well, why is the film focusing on this? Why is this theme there? Why is that? And that progressively through the semester was then building this background, right, this canvas for them to then have genuine and actually important reflection on what we were teaching in relation to the field out there. So that's, I think with engagement, sometimes we have to push a little further and go beyond. Sometimes it's beyond a classroom, right? Because we only have so many hours in the classroom to do that. And sometimes that creating that engagement with internationals needs to be school-wide or faculty-wide to look at what else is missing in that part. And again, that part of implicit messaging, I keep coming back to that, but I could give you hundreds of examples where in our practices, we teach for insiders. And then these students arrive and they're not insiders. And we forget to deconstruct the language so that they actually understand the expectations. So obviously it works with working on your rubrics, being as explicit as possible, but that work is lifelong. If you're involved in a field, you have to carry on doing that continuously. An example I can give you, for example, in education, we love having assessments around journaling, right? You're journaling your learning or you're journaling your experience. Well, to an international student who has not come from, hasn't done an undergrad in Canada, the notion of journaling has no meaning, no relevance. So unless you spend the time to say, this is what culturally we mean by journaling in an education context in North America, then we have this blank face. We have students who disengage, who don't perform well because they don't even understand the purpose of your assessment before they even engage with the assessment. So these are all, I think, important reflections that we have to do and that UDL helps us. Again, I'd stress that sometimes people say, oh, UDL is a bit of a religion, it's like a sect, it's like a club. I don't see it as that. I really see it as a lens that's convenient. And often it actually brings back, I know at some tables people were talking about practices they already have, it brings it back into a convenient vehicle that is easy to explain to people who have never encountered it, easy to use with new faculty and new instructors when they're joining a school or program, and just also allows you to have conversations elsewhere, right? The great thing with this is you can jump on a plane, go to a conference somewhere else, and people start engaging with you on UDL because they go straight into this discussion that we're having, and we're able to get into rich conversations from the get-go and use the same language. That's all it really is. So why is it important? I wanted to finish with this, and the chapter goes on to quite a bit about this. Well, having worked in disability, we've been talking about UDL for a long time. Certainly in Canada, a whole decade when there's been sort of an active voice within Canada on UDL, but things don't happen. Why don't they happen? Because we still see disability as being a minority discourse. We know, oh, there's 5% of students that register with accessibility, and yes, they're there, they're present, yes, we have to care for them, yes, we have a legal obligation, but we still react to it as a minority discourse. Now, I've discussed to you the relevance of it with disability. I've said there's emerging literature on using UDL with Indigenous students, and that's very powerful too. Jennifer Katz, if you're interested at UBC, does a lot of work on that. And here I'm talking about using it with 25, 26% of the campus when they are international students. When you put these three voices together, I'll let you do the mathematics, but you're no longer talking about a minority discourse. You're talking about a 40% slide of your campus that actually benefits them this and really depends on this to fully engage with their learning. So strategically, this is important too, because what I argue in the chapter is that advocates from UDL in disability and advocates from UDL international students sort of services and in Indigenous education need to come together to actually use this strategically on campus and show the relevance of this, because this is how change happens. When you show that we're in a neoliberal environment, you've got to show that it matters enough for the greater number of people that change needs to happen. And I think we're there. We had this conjuncture where that's another benefit from looking at UDL and using that vocabulary with international students. It becomes a catalyst for change. So what do we need to do differently? Create osmosis between accessibility services, international students, and Indigenous services. That's not easy because usually on campus we have different training, different backgrounds, different professional organizations. We're not used to actually go cross-sector and say, knocking on doors saying, hey, we should sit down and work like this together. When I was at McGill, we did a lot of that, and it did take a lot of proactive knocking on doors and knocking down doors and saying, hang on, we should actually be doing this together. So working with First People's House and working with International Students Office and saying, this is relevant to all of you and we actually need to use this vocabulary. So there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done at organization level. Widen the current wording of professional development around UDL so that international student support staff can identify with it and embrace it. Because one of the problems is, as I've said, historically, UDL comes from disability sector. So a lot of the examples, a lot of the illustrations that are given are very geared to disability. So we need to widen that and actually show the relevance to and use a vocabulary that is flexible and that works for any context. Encourage international support services to widen their discourse from multiculturalism to active discussion and pedagogy, because I think that's where we are, right? We're still saying, oh, we need to integrate students from multicultural perspective, make sure that they're integrated socially. It's beyond that. We need to look at the classroom. There's actually issues there that are happening in the classroom in terms of pedagogy, and I think we need to be lucid about that, and actually it's time to tackle that. And demonstrate to faculty that practices adopted for students with disability have great impact on the inclusion of international students. So what I had the chance to do for 3 years, but I think we can do it on any campus and in any sort of environment, and that is really beneficial. Any work that you do with UDL, anyway, whether it's disability or international students, it's really about encouraging people to try that and then to draw as much benefit from that, and that gives them the satisfaction to want to go back and try it a little bit more. It's not an overnight process, right? You don't look at UDL and suddenly say, I'm going back and I'm changing all my assessment, all my instruction. You do this progressively. But what I keep saying to people is when you try it, you get such satisfaction from the student feedback that it gives you the motivation to then go back and try something else and progressively change your entire delivery and your entire assessment to do that. The great thing with a reflection such as UDL is that it really just extends your toolbox. Every semester you try something else, then it's in your toolbox. Then you don't need to think about it again. That toolbox just becomes wider and wider and wider. Right? This notion of a rubric that can be used in any format of delivery. Once you've done that reflection, it's there. It's a reflex. You do it automatically. You no longer have to put effort into it. So we're back to this notion of sustainability. Sometimes people say, is it tough to do this shift to UDL? And I think it's important to be transparent and say it's tough at the beginning, but it's sustainable change. Right? Just as if you switch the engine on your car, it's costly to start with, but it's going to be good in the long term. This is the same. It's about actually putting that little effort in redesign and actually being willing to actively start redesigning from a non-ethnocentric sort of perspective, and then that pays off. Then you no longer have to do the work. The benefits are long term and are spread over many years. So that's about it, I think. If you're interested, it's in a book that was published in 2019. With 21 other papers on international perspective on universal design for learning. And those are my details. Thank you very much. We'll probably have 2 minutes for questions if anyone has questions. No? Yes?
Well, no one else has. Thank you very much. That was really informative. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very informative. Just because I'm new to UDL, do you have I know at the beginning you had it on the slide, but just a very short definition just from the top of your head. The way I understood what you were saying, it's a way to make classrooms inclusive, but yeah, can you explain?
So it's hard sometimes to be as concise as possible, but still keep enough in there to make it relevant. I would say it's a lens on your practice that pushes you to shift away from a medical model or a deficit model, and to put the onus back not on the person who's different, but on you and your practices as a designer. Right? As long as you keep those elements in there, you've got the crunch of UDL. Yeah, and if you're interested, if you're starting up, there's more and more resources. Sometimes it gets daunting because there's so many resources now. But one that's useful for us, there's a CAST used to have a website, but mostly for K-12, and now they've started a new website which is called UDL on Campus. It's really easy to find, and it's a whole series of case studies, basically, of universities in North America that are showcasing what they're doing around universal design. So it's a nice, soft approach into it. UDL on Campus.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I would argue that these alternative learning environments or these environments that bring different ways of representation, different ways of learning, different ways of engagement, that they're not just about creating optimum learning opportunities for international students or Indigenous students or students with disabilities, but in fact, they create optimum learning for everybody, even our sort of traditional Western North American learner, that it opens up dimensions of learning that they perhaps have shut down. They express themselves in new ways when you create this environment. This is about multiple ways of learning that they optimize for everybody. I mean, they're wonderful environments.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Mark. And that's the cherry on the sundae, right? Once you embark on this because of the pressing need, you realize that actually it's benefits for all. And it was interesting when I presented this to Australia, people at the end said, what about the reaction of students who are not international and don't have disability? And I said, well, try it, and you will see that you get a lot of satisfaction from them too. And to finish on this word, but Cal said when you use UDL, you end up with an expert learner, and the way they know themselves and their strength and the best ways to demonstrate their learning. So that's the hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you.